Joining me today is the town manager of Bridgewater, Michael Dutton, and the superintendent of the BR School District, Derek Swenson. Gentlemen, thank you very much for taking a few minutes out of your time during a very busy time in your respective roles here in the community. So, Mr. Swenson, I want to start off with you because as restrictions and mandates started to take effect at the beginning of March last year, students and teachers had to go from full in-person learning to remote learning, and we did switch to hybrid at a point over the past year as well. As not just the superintendent here in town, but as a parent of the district, can you take us through the processes that you went through to your decision making over the past year, because you had to make some important decisions very quickly early on.
Right. So and thank you, John, for allowing us this forum to discuss some of these topics. For us, we're coming on the 1 year anniversary of the original shutdown on March 13th by Governor Baker. At that point, we had already determined as a district that we were going to shut down and go remote for 2 weeks prior to that, only because we started to see our in-district numbers on the rise. And we and have since that time continued to work with our local health agents from the departments of health to really kind of try to forecast where we were going to be at certain periods of time. And at that time, we felt as though with the numbers being high and some of our staffing numbers being high too, that going remote, for those 2 weeks in March might be able to, kind of flatten those numbers, not knowing at the time where this thing was going. We were so early on and not any of us really knowing, what the whole ramifications were of how the pandemic was going to play out. So basically, we really depended upon a lot of guidance from the state at that point, mostly through the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education through Commissioner Riley. And at that point, the governor had decided to remain the year remote throughout the Commonwealth. And then in June of 2002, on June 25th, Commissioner Riley came out with about a 250-page document of guidance where we had to do some planning on the three models, whether to stay fully remote, go hybrid, or full in person. We did our space assessment. We realized that we could not bring back all of our students into our sites based upon, at that time, the 3-foot minimum that DESE was requiring, even though CDC was recommending the 6-foot. One thing that folks have to continue to remember is that we're down a 1,000-person school down on 500 South Street. So that really impacted our ability to come back at full in person. We felt as though we could do it within the hybrid model, and that's basically what we planned for. We realized, however, that was going to be a situation for parents. Because within the hybrid model, it was going to be basically 2 days of in-person instruction and 3 days remote. So a lot of planning had to go into that, a lot of public relations and communicating that plan to the communities at large had to go into that. And I think we did a really good job of communicating that. Initially, I think it was working to the point where what a hybrid model would provide you, nothing's going to ever take the place of in-person brick and mortar schooling. Over time, we realized some of the gaps and deficiencies within the hybrid model, tried to do the best we could to remedy those, on the fly. But looking at, where we currently are in terms of a possible return for our elementary students come April 5th. We are very excited about that because we realize that, especially the younger populations, the remote learning side of it, from an age appropriateness standpoint, is detrimental to those populations. So we're looking to bring those students back April 5th. We're in the planning of that. And, our hope is to eventually bring back our middle and high school, and the grand plan is to return in the fall with a full reentry in-person model.
So I want to talk about the reaction to the hybrid and remote learning, because as you mentioned, when this first started, I think I was there with a lot of people. I thought this was going to be 2-3 weeks. We'll eventually get back to normal, but a year later, we're still going on here. The remote hybrid model has been tested not just across the country or across the state, but across the country as well. What have been the response you've heard from parents, administrators, even some of the students as far as how this past year has gone through the different learning stages?
Sure. I think it's all depends upon, the individual and who you speak to. There are some parents who chose the fully remote model and they felt as though that was in the best interest of their child from a health and safety standpoint, and have really been happy with that decision. You have parents that really feel as though the hybrid model does not fully encompass everything that, again, a brick and mortar traditional 5 days week schooling would, and I have to agree with them in that respect. The biggest feedback that we get, and this is shown in the data not only throughout the Commonwealth but throughout the nation, is the social emotional impact it's really had on our students. Academically, I think our teachers have done the best they could. They've worked incredibly hard in order to produce asynchronous, which is either videoed or online type instructional strategies, or asynchronous to use live streaming, which a majority of our teachers have incorporated on those remote days for students that are home, along with the students that they have in front of them. But the real true impact, I feel, of all of this has been the social and emotional impact of our students, them being withdrawn from their peers. And not only from, a school standpoint. Obviously, there have been things that within society, we have been limited to, youth athletics, different types of extracurricular activities, for all of these school age children. So I think that social emotional impact is definitely one that stands out for us. That's one thing that we've really spoke a lot about internally as a team upon our return. How do we kind of remedy that for some of our students with some of our social emotional learning strategies that we have through our school adjustment counselors and the rest? So, the academic impact is one thing, and we can always kind of look to put in those interventions and those type of accelerated programs we need to do to kind of get kids up to speed academically. It's really the long-term impact that we have our eyes on, our watchful eyes on, in terms of the social emotional piece to that, and the mental health aspect of it that we're truly concerned with.
Now, it's something that one of the parents talked about at the last school committee meeting. I think the social impact here. Mr. Dunn, I want to bring you in here because watching the town council meetings, really since the start of this pandemic, one thing you pointed out was the fact that the town never really shut down. Granted, employees went from in person to remote. They did take remote phone calls, but really the town didn't fully shut down. As a town manager, how important was it to keep business going because bills still have to be paid, processes still have to be accomplished in town?
No, that's a good question, John. And I think we made a very concerted effort to make sure that we could keep our operations going. And as the superintendent pointed out, back a year ago, literally a year ago, it was a whole different world. We didn't know what was going to happen. We had no idea what the future would hold. In fact, if you remember, people hunkered down in their homes. Cars weren't on the street. People were being told, don't go out unless you absolutely have to go to the grocery store. Stay home. Wash your hands. Don't interact with people. Some of that still is in effect today, but I think it's a little bit different world. People have learned how to take precautions and still go about a lot of their daily lives, whether it's a work life or social life or what have you. I think they've understood what precautions they need to take. So the world has sort of kept moving. But at the time, if you remember, things were just absolutely frozen. I remember literally a year ago bringing every department in to the meeting room down the hall from me and saying, look, we don't know what's going to happen, but here's what your department has to do to make sure that we keep things running, whether it be make sure we provide clean water, make sure the sewer runs, make sure that bills get paid, make sure that we can accept tax payments, make sure that we can do all the things that we normally would do if we were actually inside the building. So at that point, we told everybody to go home. The very fortunate thing for us was that we had spent a fair amount of money making sure that we had the technology in place. Obviously, we didn't know, what a pandemic was going to be and what kind of impact that would have. But we were in a position to be able to be quite flexible. So for the most part, sent people home. We were able to, give them the technology to bring home in order for them to do their jobs. And we had a lot of planning at the time around making sure things as simple, you would think as simple as who's going to pick up the mail? How's the mail going to be handled? Back then, if you remember, mail was being quarantined for 24, 48 hours before anybody could touch it. So I think some of those fears have abated, obviously, but back then that was a big deal. We didn't even know how to treat the mail. So we created systems. We had a multiple day quarantine period for the mail. We make sure we segregate it, and then we assign certain staff to actually open the mail and make sure that it could be scanned and delivered to people that are working remotely. So we went through a lot of planning in order to get to that point. And since then, we've continued to build on our technology. So we have the ability now to have remote meetings. We can have a mix of remote and in-person meetings. We can have people all over the country join in one meeting very simply via Zoom or Teams, Microsoft Teams. So we've got multiple ways to communicate that we didn't even fathom a year ago. I think most people, maybe less than 1% of the population knew what Zoom was a year ago, and look at us now. It's almost become a noun, verb, adjective, adverb. It's common use everywhere. So we've learned a lot of lessons, obviously, along the way. But very fortunately for us, we had invested in a fair amount of technology. And quite honestly, I think we are one of the very few towns, as I've said before, one of the very few towns that didn't skip a beat. We could keep on going and make sure that the taxpayers could get the services that they needed. We also decided back then we were going to keep very careful logs about incoming calls. We adjusted and improved our phone system so that we can take calls virtually anywhere in the world through laptops. But we also made sure that we had call logs and visitor logs to the extent that people were in the building during the last year to make sure that we knew how long it took to satisfy a taxpayer request and respond to a taxpayer phone call. So we kept careful eye on that. But as Superintendent said, our staff, really, really proud of them during the course of this entire pandemic, because they really, to a person, have really stepped up and made sure that the services that we can provide as best as possible.
Now, throughout the year, we've shown the 2-week stats as far as what the state releases for town-by-town breakdown for COVID numbers. And Bridgewater didn't have an astronomically high case count compared to other cities and towns in the Bay State. There was one spike in January. But when you think about everything the town actually has, you have the district, you have the university, the correctional facility, not to mention tens and thousands of residents all together. You also have businesses that had to change things up a little bit, but they remained open, much to their credit. How significant was it to keep the case count down with all these different entities to worry about, but B, to also keep the local businesses open in a town where a lot of the businesses are mom and pop shops?
That's a really good point. And we tried very, very hard to make sure that we could accommodate the needs of the community, the needs of businesses. In fact, you'll recall back before the end of last year, we had asked the council to waive fees, and the councilors actually came to us in order to waive fees on annual license renewals. And that made sense. It's not a huge amount of revenue for us. And when we did a careful analysis of our finances, we realized that during this year, especially with some of the federal CARES funding that was in place, we could sacrifice the renewal fees on annual licenses. That for some businesses, that was a huge thing. Even though it's not a huge amount of money, just being able to do that for our business community meant a lot to people. I heard a really great story. One of the businesses, and quite frankly, I don't know which one, but one of the businesses that was able to not have to pay that annual fee was not experiencing the kind of disastrous year that a lot of other businesses were. And that business decided to donate what would have been their relicensing fee to a charity, because a food pantry charity, because they appreciated what the town did, but felt that they shouldn't benefit from that because they were actually doing fine during the pandemic. So that was a great story, and so I'm sure there are more stories like that. But in terms of businesses and supporting businesses and making sure that they can continue to operate, we were out there. We said, hey, we will. If you have some idea how we can help you, we are happy to help you. And fortunately, most of the businesses have survived. A couple have closed permanently, but most of them have survived, which is knock on wood, a good, especially in a time when BSU, really the population of BSU is probably a tenth of what it normally is, and that market, those folks that use the businesses in town just aren't there. So I think everybody's sort of struggled, but we're beginning to be able to see the light on the other side.
Things slowly starting to come back to normal, hopefully, over the next few weeks. Bringing the superintendent back in here once again. At the last school committee meeting, yourself and the assistant superintendent, Ryan Powers, went over some of the things that need to work out for a full in-person return, not just for the spring, but also for the fall. With trends starting to improve across the area and vaccine availability on the rise for teachers coming up in the next week or so from this taping, we know the spring's going to have its challenges, but looking ahead to the fall, are we at a point where we can expect as close to a normal reopening for the fall as we're used to?
Well, again, John, I think a lot of it depends upon guidance we receive from the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. Our plan is to return to a full reentry for in-person learning. That may mean some of the situations that we detailed at the school committee meeting, meaning that if social distancing is still a requirement, even at the 3-foot mark, we may need some of our larger communal spaces within our buildings, such as our cafeterias, such as libraries, gymnasiums, to utilize as a classroom or learning space that'll be able to accommodate more students at the 3-foot mark. With that being said, with those higher class sizes, we would obviously put more professional support in there for our teachers and our students, whether that be an additional teacher in a co-teaching model or an educational support professional or a paraprofessional in there to provide the support so that that student ratio number isn't 1 to say 35 or 1 to 40. You put 1 or 2 other adults in that, it could be 1 to 15, 1 to 20 is what we're looking at initially. So the impacts are going to be converting some of our communal spaces into classroom space, which means putting in technology, putting in staffing, really converting those to more of a classroom type setting. So we have a lot of work ahead of us this summer once again. But in the end, we know that the end game is worth it, and that is to get our kids back in to a full in-person learning model, and to hopefully align that as with as much a sense of normalcy as possible, while still navigating some of the things that will still truly be out there. If you have to ask my professional opinion, when we get to a full sense of normalcy, will probably be the 22-23 school year. And next year is still going to have its challenges, but we are committed to make sure that we're going to bring our students back, and we're going to bring them back into learning environments that were just as robust and as they were prior to the shutdown last March. And that is our commitment to our families and all of our stakeholders, but more importantly to our students. So that's what we are really truly planning for right now. There's a lot that goes with that, because as we're planning for the spring, we're also kind of at the same time unilaterally planning for the fall. And I think the spring will allow us that stress test, almost kind of a spring training for us to get in there, get our cuts, and see the things that we may have to adjust going into the fall. So I think it's a great idea to get students back in, first and foremost, for the reasons that I talked about earlier with the academic piece and the social emotional element, but also to allow us that, pseudo stress test to really truly identify areas that we're going to have to focus on over the summer to make this truly a learning environment that we want to bring our students back to, for our students, for our staff, and make sure first and foremost it is safe and a healthy environment as well.
And finally, this has been a very stressful year for both of you, along with everybody in the BR area. Um, in your respective roles, starting off with the superintendent, are there any positives from the experiences that you've seen over the past year that you're going to take with you from this pandemic year?
Sure. I'm truly a cup half full. I always try to find the positives. Even I think back to when we had the roof collapse back in 2015, the sense of community that came out of that, that really dire situation. With this one, just really shows you the type of staff and faculty we have within our district. The things that they've done. I mean, there's never been a time in the history of our country where we've taught public education through a pandemic. I mean, this was starting ground level, no owner's manual on this one, right? So we had to build this while we were flying it. And I got to tell you, from our teachers to our paraprofessionals, to our administrative team, to our custodial staff, to our facilities folks, the people that work for Chartwells, the food service piece to it, everyone came together and did what was right by our students. Was it perfect? No model was in any community, but we did our best each and every day to make this a place that was first, safe and healthy for our students to come to, but also provide an academic and social emotional support system for our students that I believe was second to none throughout the Commonwealth. Also, too, truly the sense that, you hear a lot of chatter on some of the social media from, some parents with concerns, and we hear their voices. We truly do. I'm a parent myself. I hear it. But we also have those parents that have reached out to us and, have thanked us for everything that we've done in order to, provide their children with the closest sense of normalcy as possible. So I've received a lot more of the positive feedback from our communities and our parents than we have, from some of the folks that sometimes express their concerns through the social media medium. So with that being said, I'd say, the takeaways for me is the incredible staff that I have and the incredible families that I'm very fortunate to be able to work with each and every day here within the town of Bridgewater and the town of Rainham.
Excellent work from people in the school district and the town as well. Mr. Dutton, any positives that you can take from this unique year for many?
Honestly, John, I think there are a lot of positives. I echo what the superintendent said about an incredible staff. Not only in the school district but in the town, very dedicated, solely focused on getting the job done, and making sure we do it as well as we possibly can. So I think that's definitely a positive. I think the other lesson, that there are a bunch of lessons that we've learned throughout this, but I think another piece of it is really how important local communities are when these kinds of things happen. Now, a year ago, nobody expected. I can remember being at a social gathering, a supper on February 29th, leap year last year, and people were laughing about, what was going on, because it was just kind of over there. It was something happening in China, and it wasn't something that was happening here. And boy, how quickly the tone changed in the course of a few weeks, how quickly that tone changed. So when I go back and I look at the last year, I think, okay, things become very localized when nationwide, when things go bad. people turn inward, turn to their communities, turn to their churches, turn to their civic organizations. And those things are really critically important to keeping a community healthy overall. And so I think it's sort of confirmation. What I've always believed is that local communities are in a much better position to help people. I continue to believe that. We've had obviously some difficulties getting vaccines now, and the state has decided that no, they're not going to ship vaccines to individual cities and towns, with a few exceptions. And that's unfortunate, because I think individual cities and towns are in a much better position to be able to know how to get an effective vaccination site up and working. But that's a decision that was made, and we'll have to live with that. But it all, the last year really highlights the importance of local community and people getting involved. We have seen over the course of the last 6-8 months a record number of new people getting involved in town boards and committees, which is fabulous. There's a lot of interest in shaping the future of the town, more so than there was a year ago. And if that's one of the ancillary benefits of this, then that's great. So it's involvement, it's focus on local community and each other, which is kind of refreshing.
And as you mentioned earlier, we've learned a lot more about Zoom meetings as we meet over Zoom for this interview. Thank you both very much for taking a few minutes and talking to us.
Thank you, John.
My pleasure.